In the spring of 1944, deep within a cramped intelligence office in Manila, a Japanese general hunched over a hand-drawn map that would make his colleagues question his sanity. General Yuitsu Tsuchihashi, a 52-year-old career officer with wire-rimmed spectacles and an obsessive attention to detail, had just completed what he believed to be his masterwork. A comprehensive prediction of General Douglas MacArthur's next 18 months of offensive operations in the Pacific. When he presented it to Imperial General Headquarters, the response was swift and brutal. They called him a defeatist, an alarmist, and worse, a man who had lost his nerve. Within weeks, his predictions were filed away and forgotten, dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of an officer who had spent too long staring at maps in isolation. Tsuchihashi's reputation as an eccentric had preceded him throughout most of his military career. Unlike his peers who rose through traditional command positions, he had spent the better part of 2 decades in intelligence roles, developing an almost supernatural ability to read patterns in seemingly random data. He wore civilian clothes whenever regulations permitted, kept irregular hours, and maintained an extensive personal library of Western military texts that raised eyebrows among the more nationalist officers. His colleagues whispered that he thought too much like the enemy, that he had become contaminated by Western logic. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army, where conformity and aggressive confidence were prized above all else, Tsuchihashi's methodical caution made him an outlier, a man whose warnings carried the unfortunate stench of pessimism. The prevailing Japanese mindset in early 1944 was built on a foundation of carefully cultivated overconfidence. Despite the loss of Guadalcanal and the mounting pressure across the Pacific, Japanese military doctrine remained rooted in the belief that superior fighting spirit would ultimately prevail over American industrial might. Intelligence estimates consistently underestimated Allied capabilities, not because the data was unavailable, but because acknowledging the true extent of American strength was psychologically unacceptable to commanders who had built their careers on the promise of inevitable victory. MacArthur, in particular, was viewed through a lens of contempt. Japanese intelligence characterized him as a cautious, methodical plotter who would advance slowly up the New Guinea coast, taking each fortified position in sequence. This assumption seemed reasonable, even obvious, given the massive defensive preparations Japan had made across the Pacific island chains. But Tsuchihashi saw something different. He had identified what his superiors considered impossible: that MacArthur would bypass entire Japanese strongholds, leaping hundreds of miles past fortified islands to strike at weakly defended targets deep in what the Japanese considered their secure rear areas. It was a prediction so audacious, so contrary to established military doctrine, that it seemed to validate every suspicion his colleagues harbored about his increasingly unstable judgment. The map itself was a work of obsessive detail spread across 4 connected sheets of translucent rice paper. Unlike the clean, official charts produced by Imperial General Headquarters, Tsuchihashi's creation was covered in layers of colored pencil annotations, probability calculations, and handwritten notes in both Japanese and English. Red circles marked predicted American landing zones. Blue arrows traced potential naval approach routes. Black numbers indicated his estimated timelines, some suggesting the Americans would strike targets more than 1,000 miles ahead of their current positions within mere months. Most disturbing to those who examined it were the crossed-out Japanese flags over major bases like Biak and Hollandia, positions that housed tens of thousands of troops and were considered impregnable bastions of the defensive perimeter. Tsuchihashi's methodology was as unconventional as the conclusions it produced. While official Japanese intelligence relied heavily on radio intercepts and agent reports, Tsuchihashi had developed what he called negative space analysis. He studied not where American forces were, but where they were conspicuously absent. He tracked the patterns of Allied reconnaissance flights, noting that American aircraft seemed to be photographing minor coastal villages and undefended bays with the same intensity they devoted to major Japanese bases. He collected every scrap of information about American construction projects, cross-referencing requisitions for airfield matting, fuel storage tanks, and harbor facilities to estimate the scale of future operations. He had even obtained copies of American aviation magazines from neutral Portugal, studying articles about carrier aircraft range and payload capabilities to calculate the maximum reach of American naval air power. What set Tsuchihashi apart was his willingness to think like MacArthur, to inhabit the mental framework of an enemy commander operating under completely different constraints and doctrines than Japanese officers. He understood that MacArthur was under immense political pressure to recapture the Philippines quickly, that the American general's ego demanded dramatic, headline-grabbing victories rather than slow, grinding advances. Most importantly, Tsuchihashi recognized that American industrial capacity meant MacArthur didn't need to capture Japanese bases to neutralize them. With enough ships, aircraft, and supplies, the Americans could simply bypass strongpoints, leaving them to wither on the vine while the offensive rolled forward hundreds of miles beyond. In stark contrast, official Japanese intelligence was trapped in a prison of mirror imaging, assuming the enemy would operate according to Japanese military logic. Their estimates predicted a methodical Allied advance up the northern coast of New Guinea, then a pause for consolidation, then a careful approach to the Philippines through the Central Pacific Islands. This analysis was based on what a Japanese commander would do given similar circumstances: secure your flanks, maintain your supply lines, reduce enemy strongpoints systematically. The idea that an enemy would deliberately leave powerful Japanese garrisons operational in his rear area struck the intelligence establishment as not just unlikely, but militarily insane. Tsuchihashi's map, which predicted exactly this insane strategy, was therefore dismissed as the work of an officer who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of warfare itself. What the Japanese intelligence establishment didn't know was that Tsuchihashi had accurately divined the cornerstone of MacArthur's entire Pacific strategy, the campaign of aggressive bypassing that American planners called leapfrogging, and that would become known to history as island hopping. MacArthur's plan was radical in its efficiency and ruthless in its logic. Rather than expending American lives capturing every Japanese-held island and coastal strongpoint, he would use Allied air and naval superiority to isolate enemy garrisons, cutting them off from resupply and reinforcement. Then, while Japanese troops sat uselessly on their bypassed islands, consuming their dwindling supplies and unable to influence the broader war, MacArthur would strike hundreds of miles deeper into the Pacific, seizing weakly defended positions and turning them into major bases for the next leap forward. The risks of this strategy were substantial and obvious to contemporary military observers. Each leap forward left powerful Japanese forces in MacArthur's rear, theoretically capable of interdicting his vulnerable supply lines. If the Japanese Navy could concentrate its remaining strength at the right moment, it might catch American amphibious forces during a landing operation, turning a daring offensive into a catastrophic defeat. Moreover, the intelligence requirements for such a strategy were enormous. MacArthur needed to know not just where Japanese forces were strong, but where they were weak. He needed to identify landing beaches, estimate defensive capabilities, and time his operations to exploit windows of vulnerability. A single miscalculation could send thousands of American troops ashore into the teeth of a reinforced Japanese garrison, resulting in the kind of bloodbath that would destroy both military careers and public support for the Pacific War. From the Japanese perspective in early 1944, MacArthur's actual intentions seemed not just unlikely, but borderline impossible. The idea that he would leap from Sidor on New Guinea's northern coast all the way to Hollandia, bypassing the massive garrison at Wewak, struck Japanese planners as so reckless that it didn't warrant serious consideration. Hollandia was more than 500 miles beyond the current front lines, protected by what the Japanese believed to be the effective range limitations of Allied air cover. Similarly, the notion that MacArthur would subsequently jump another 500 miles to Biak, then vault all the way to Morotai in preparation for the Philippines assault, seemed to violate every principle of sound military planning. Yet this was precisely the sequence of operations that Tsuchihashi had marked on his crazy map, complete with approximate dates that would prove eerily accurate. Tsuchihashi's map showed red circles around Hollandia, Leyte, Biak, Morotai, and ultimately Leyte in the Philippines. His timeline predicted major American operations in April, May, September, and October of 1944. His annotations noted that MacArthur would rely on carrier-based air support for the longer leaps, that he would prioritize targets with suitable terrain for rapid airfield construction, and that the American general would deliberately create the impression of attacking in one location while actually preparing to strike elsewhere. In essence, Tsuchihashi had not just predicted where MacArthur would go, but had accurately analyzed the operational logic that would drive each decision. The map didn't just align with MacArthur's actual future maneuvers. It was a nearly perfect roadmap of the campaign that would unfold over the next 12 months. The first validation of Tsuchihashi's predictions came on April 22, 1944, when American forces conducted simultaneous landings at Hollandia and Leyte, exactly as his map had indicated. More than 80,000 Japanese troops sat uselessly at Wewak, 100 miles to the east, while MacArthur's forces came ashore against minimal opposition at Hollandia. The Japanese had stationed only about 11,000 troops there, most of them administrative and supply personnel who had never expected to face a major assault. Within days, American engineers had 3 airfields operational, providing the land-based air cover necessary for the next leap forward. When news of the landing reached Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers rushed to pull Tsuchihashi's map from the archives. There, in red pencil dated 3 months earlier, was a circle around Hollandia with the notation Late April, airfield seizure priority, expect 40,000 plus troops. The uncanny accuracy continued through the spring and summer. On May 27th, American forces landed on Biak Island, a target Tsuchihashi had circled with the notation Critical Airfield, May or early June. The Japanese had fortified Biak more heavily than Hollandia, resulting in a tough fight that lasted several weeks, but the operation unfolded precisely where and approximately when Tsuchihashi had predicted. On September 15th, MacArthur's forces seized Morotai, a lightly defended island that provided the final stepping stone for the Philippines assault. Tsuchihashi's map had marked Morotai with an arrow and the words September, Philippines preparation, possibly uncontested. The landing met virtually no resistance, with the island secured in less than a week. The tragic irony of Tsuchihashi's prescience cannot be overstated. At Hollandia, Japanese commanders were caught completely off guard because they had ignored his predictions and concentrated their defenses elsewhere. Thousands of tons of supplies, dozens of aircraft, and critical intelligence documents fell into American hands because the Japanese had assumed MacArthur would never strike so far beyond his established front lines. At Biak, Japanese reinforcement efforts were hampered by the need to hastily redirect troops and supplies that had been positioned to defend against the more conservative offensive that official intelligence had predicted. At every stage of MacArthur's campaign, Japanese forces found themselves reacting to events that Tsuchihashi had warned them about months in advance, but which they had refused to take seriously until American landing craft were already approaching the beaches. The psychological dimension of Tsuchihashi's foresight raises profound questions about the nature of strategic intuition. Was his accuracy the result of superior analytical methodology, or had he developed an almost empathic ability to think like his American adversary? Those who worked with him during this period reported that he would sometimes spend hours staring at maps in silence, tracing potential routes with his finger, muttering calculations about distances, fuel consumption, and airfield construction timelines. He had created elaborate charts tracking the arrival of American shipping in the Pacific, cross-referencing these numbers with intelligence about troop deployments to estimate the scale and timing of future operations. Yet there was also an intuitive element to his work that transcended pure analysis. Tsuchihashi seemed to understand MacArthur's psychology, his need for dramatic gestures, his willingness to accept calculated risks for the promise of spectacular results. In a sense, Tsuchihashi had become MacArthur's shadow, a Japanese general who understood the American commander better than MacArthur's own staff officers did. In the decades following the war, General Yuitsu Tsuchihashi remained a footnote in military history, his contributions largely unknown outside of specialized academic circles. He survived the war and lived quietly in Kyoto until his death in 1972, never writing memoirs or seeking recognition for his prescient analysis. The famous map, discovered by American intelligence officers in captured Japanese files, was classified for years before being donated to the National Archives, where it remains today as a testament to both Tsuchihashi's brilliance and the institutional blindness that prevented his warnings from being heeded. Modern military historians who have studied his work consider him one of the most perceptive intelligence analysts of the Pacific War, a man whose clear-eyed assessment of Allied capabilities and intentions stood in stark contrast to the wishful thinking that dominated Japanese strategic planning. The true tragedy of Tsuchihashi's story lies not in his lack of recognition, but in the thousands of lives that might have been saved had his analysis been taken seriously. If Japanese commanders had repositioned their forces according to his predictions, if they had fortified the targets he identified and evacuated the garrisons he said would be bypassed, the Pacific War would have unfolded very differently. MacArthur's leapfrogging strategy succeeded in part because it exploited Japanese assumptions about how the campaign would develop. Had those assumptions been challenged by Tsuchihashi's alternative analysis, the American advance would have been slower, bloodier, and far more costly. In a bitter paradox, Tsuchihashi's failure to convince his superiors probably shortened the war and saved American lives, even as it condemned Japanese forces to a series of devastating surprises. The lessons from Tsuchihashi's experience resonate far beyond World War II military history. His story illustrates the institutional dangers of groupthink, the tendency of organizations to reject analysis that challenges comfortable assumptions or threatens established hierarchies. In the Japanese military of 1944, admitting that Tsuchihashi might be correct meant acknowledging that Japan was facing an enemy with overwhelming advantages in intelligence, mobility, and strategic flexibility. It meant accepting that the war might be unwinnable through conventional defensive strategies. For commanders who had staked their careers and reputations on existing plans, it was psychologically easier to dismiss Tsuchihashi as a defeatist eccentric than to grapple with the disturbing implications of his analysis. The same pattern has repeated itself throughout history, in military organizations, intelligence agencies, and corporate boardrooms. The lonely analyst whose inconvenient truths are ignored until events prove them catastrophically correct. Perhaps the most haunting question surrounding Tsuchihashi's crazy map is the counterfactual it suggests. What if he had been listened to? What if Imperial General Headquarters had taken his predictions seriously and fundamentally restructured their Pacific defense strategy around his insights? The answer is simultaneously obvious and unknowable. Japanese forces would have been better positioned to contest MacArthur's advances, potentially inflicting enough casualties to slow or even temporarily halt the American offensive. But whether this would have changed the ultimate outcome of the war is doubtful. By 1944, American industrial and military superiority was so overwhelming that even perfect Japanese intelligence and optimal defensive positioning could only delay the inevitable. Tsuchihashi understood this perhaps better than anyone else in the Japanese military establishment. His map wasn't just a prediction of where MacArthur would strike. It was a recognition of how thoroughly Japan had been outmaneuvered strategically, operationally, and intellectually. In the end, the crazy map was only crazy to those who refused to see the truth it revealed.